On my last day as CEO, my daughter-in-law raised a toast. To everyone who makes this company run, except the hag who owns it and steals the profit. My son burst out laughing. I just looked at my husband. He nodded. My next words left her frozen.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
But let me start from the beginning of that evening, because the pain I felt didn't begin with Victoria's cruel words. It started the moment I walked into the conference room that had been decorated for what everyone believed was my retirement celebration. The room buzzed with conversations that died the second I appeared in the doorway. 43 employees, people I'd worked alongside for decades, suddenly found their champagne glasses fascinating. The silence stretched uncomfortably until my assistant Janet broke it with forced enthusiasm. "Mrs. Henderson, you look lovely tonight." Her voice carried that particular tone people use when they're trying too hard to be normal. I smoothed down my navy blue dress, the nicest one I owned, and tried to ignore the way Victoria's friends from the marketing department were whispering behind their hands. I'd built Morrison Industries from nothing 38 years ago. Started in my garage after my first husband died, leaving me with a 2-year-old son and enough debt to drown in. Back then, people laughed at a young widow trying to manufacture industrial cleaning supplies. Now we employed over 300 people across 4 states. Robert, my husband of 15 years, squeezed my shoulder as we made our way to the front of the room. He'd joined the company 12 years ago when we merged with his smaller firm, and he'd been my anchor through every storm since. The way his jaw tightened told me he was as uncomfortable with this whole evening as I was. "Margaret," came Victoria's voice from across the room, sweet as poisoned honey. She glided toward us in a dress that probably cost more than most employees made in a month. At 34, she was everything I'd never been. Polished, educated, born into money. When David married her 6 years ago, I'd tried so hard to welcome her. I'd given her a position in the company, mentored her, treated her like the daughter I'd never had. "Victoria." I forced a smile. "The decorations look beautiful." "Thank you. I wanted everything to be perfect for your big day." Her eyes sparkled with something that wasn't quite warmth. "After all, it's not every day someone finally accepts they're too old to run a company." The words hit like ice water, but I kept my expression neutral. Around us, conversations resumed, but I caught the sidelong glances, the barely concealed smirks from Victoria's circle. She'd been working on this narrative for months, painting me as a doddering old woman clinging to power I no longer deserved. David appeared at Victoria's side, my son who'd grown into a man I barely recognized. Where once he'd been thoughtful and kind, now he seemed hollow, always agreeing with whatever Victoria said. He kissed my cheek with the mechanical affection of obligation. "Mom, you must be so relieved," he said, his voice carrying Victoria's coaching. "No more stress, no more long hours. You can finally relax and let younger people handle the business." Younger people. As if wisdom came with a birth certificate date instead of decades of experience. I'd guided this company through 3 recessions, adapted to changing markets, built relationships that had sustained us through impossible challenges. But apparently, at 68, I was suddenly obsolete. The presentations began with Janet reading a carefully prepared speech about my distinguished career and well-earned retirement. Each word felt like dirt being thrown on a grave I wasn't ready to occupy. Department heads shared sanitized memories, their words polite but distant, as if they were already mentally adjusting to new leadership. Through it all, Victoria stood near the front, accepting congratulations from people who assumed she'd be stepping into my role. She'd positioned herself perfectly over the past 2 years, volunteering for high-profile projects, making herself indispensable to daily operations. What they didn't know was that every move had been calculated, every smile hiding her true intentions. When the formal presentations ended, Victoria stepped forward, raising her champagne glass with theatrical flair. The room fell silent, everyone sensing this was the moment they'd been waiting for. "I think it's time for a real toast," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "To all the hardworking people who've made Morrison Industries the success it is today, to the employees who arrive early and stay late, who pour their hearts into their work, who actually care about this company's future." A few people raised their glasses hesitantly, unsure where this was heading. Victoria's smile turned sharp, predatory. "To everyone who makes this company run, except the hag who owns it and steals the profit." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Someone dropped a glass. Janet gasped audibly. But what cut deepest wasn't Victoria's cruelty. It was the sound that followed. David's laughter. My son, the boy I'd raised alone, who I'd sacrificed everything for, threw back his head and laughed as if his wife had told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. Other voices joined in, nervous at first, then growing bolder as they realized they were safe in their pack mentality. I stood frozen, feeling every eye in the room on me. Some faces showed embarrassment, others barely concealed glee. These people had eaten at my table, had come to me with their problems, had built their careers on the foundation I'd created, and now they were laughing at my humiliation. The silence after the laughter died was deafening. Victoria stood there triumphant, clearly expecting me to crumble, to shuffle out in shame and leave her to claim her prize. David was still grinning, finally free to show his true feelings about the burden of having an aging mother who refused to step aside. That's when I turned to Robert. My husband's face was granite, but his eyes held the question we'd discussed so many times in the privacy of our home. Are you sure? This will change everything. I gave him the slightest nod. Robert straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Victoria, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Actually, Margaret isn't retiring. The room went dead quiet. Victoria's triumphant expression flickered. I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the pain crushing my chest. That's right. I'm not retiring. I let the words sink in before delivering the blow that would change everything. I'm selling the company. Victoria's face went white. David's mouth fell open. The champagne glass slipped from someone's nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor like all their assumptions about the future. The sale was finalized this morning, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. Morrison Industries now belongs to Hartfield Corporation. They'll be conducting their own review of all personnel and operations. In that moment, watching Victoria's world collapse around her, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not joy, exactly, but a profound sense of justice. She'd tried to destroy me with words, to humiliate me in front of people who'd once respected me. But words were just air, and respect had to be earned, not inherited. The room erupted in shocked murmurs, but I was already turning toward the door, Robert's steady presence at my side. I'd spent 38 years building something beautiful, and I'd rather see it in the hands of strangers than watch it be corrupted by people who valued cruelty over character. Behind me, I could hear Victoria's voice rising in panic, demanding answers that would have to wait until tomorrow. Tonight, I was done being anyone's victim. That night, lying in bed next to Robert, I couldn't sleep. The image of David's laughter kept playing in my mind like a broken record. When had I lost my son? When had the boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them roses turned into a man who could laugh at my humiliation? I knew the answer, even though admitting it felt like swallowing glass. It started 6 years ago, the day David brought Victoria home for Sunday dinner. She'd been charming that first evening, asking all the right questions about the business, expressing admiration for what I'd built. David's told me so much about how you started Morrison Industries, she'd said, her smile warm and genuine. It must have been incredibly difficult, raising him alone while building a company. I'd been touched by her interest, her apparent understanding of the sacrifices I'd made. When David announced their engagement 3 months later, I'd been genuinely happy. My son had found someone who seemed to appreciate not just him, but the family legacy we'd built together. The changes started small, so subtle I barely noticed them at first. Victoria would mention during family dinners that some companies were modernizing their leadership structures, or casually comment on articles she'd read about multi-generational workplace challenges. She never said anything directly about me being too old, but the seeds were planted. Then came the suggestions disguised as concern. Margaret, you've been working so hard lately. Maybe you should consider reducing your hours. Or, David and I were talking, and we think you deserve to enjoy your golden years instead of stressing about quarterly reports. Golden years. As if living meant nothing more than waiting to die comfortably. The real turning point came 2 years ago, during the Henderson account crisis. We'd been Morrison Industries' biggest client for 15 years, and their CEO had suddenly threatened to pull their contract over delivery delays, caused by a supplier problem completely outside our control. I'd spent 3 days on the phone, calling in favors, negotiating compromises, using relationships I'd built over decades to save that account. When I finally secured a new agreement that kept Henderson happy and our employees working, I'd been exhausted, but triumphant. Victoria's response still burned in my memory. Well, that was dramatic. she'd said during the company meeting where I announced we'd saved the contract. A younger executive might have handled it more efficiently without all the emotional phone calls. The comment had been delivered with a smile, wrapped in just enough ambiguity that calling her out would have made me look defensive. But the damage was done. I saw the sideways glances from employees, the barely perceptible nods of agreement from people who suddenly wondered if my emotional approach was a sign of weakness rather than the passionate commitment that had built their paychecks. That's when I realized Victoria wasn't just making casual observations. She was systematically undermining my authority, painting me as an emotional, outdated obstacle to progress. Every suggestion about my age, every comment about modern business practices, every seemingly innocent remark about succession planning was another drop of poison in the well of respect I'd spent decades building. David, my trusting, loyal David, absorbed it all without question. He'd always been susceptible to strong personalities, content to let others lead while he followed. Victoria had recognized this weakness and exploited it masterfully. "Mom's been under a lot of stress lately," he started saying during family gatherings. "Maybe she should consider stepping back a bit." When I tried to discuss my concerns with him, Victoria was always there, nodding sympathetically while redirecting the conversation. Of course, Margaret feels defensive. Change is hard at any age, but especially when you've been in control for so long. The worst part was how she turned my own words against me. Every story I'd shared about the company's early struggles became evidence of my inability to let go. Every mention of lessons learned from past challenges became proof that I was stuck in outdated thinking. "Mom still talks about the recession of '08 like it was yesterday," David would say, not realizing that my experience with that crisis was exactly what had helped us survive the pandemic shutdowns with minimal layoffs. "Victoria says we need to focus on the future, not keep relitigating the past," Victoria says. Those two words became the beginning of every conversation, the justification for every decision, the new gospel according to my daughter-in-law who'd never built anything from nothing, never had to make payroll when the account receivables were late, never had to look employees in the eye and promise their jobs were safe when everything was falling apart. The meetings became the most obvious battleground. Victoria would arrive with printed agendas and PowerPoint presentations, armed with business school terminology and consulting firm jargon. She'd present ideas that sounded innovative but ignored practical realities, propose changes that would disrupt relationships I'd spent years cultivating. When I raised concerns based on experience, she'd nod thoughtfully and then say something like, "I appreciate Margaret's historical perspective, but we need to consider whether traditional approaches are still relevant in today's market." Historical perspective, traditional approaches. Every word chosen to make me sound like a relic, a museum piece whose time had passed. The employees started looking to her instead of me during discussions. She'd positioned herself as the voice of progress while painting me as the voice of resistance. People who'd once sought my advice began going to Victoria first, treating her input as more valuable than mine. "She just has such fresh ideas," I'd overheard Janet saying to another employee. "Sometimes experience can be limiting, you know? Victoria sees possibilities that someone who's been doing things the same way for decades might miss." Janet, who'd been with me for 12 years. Janet, whose job I'd saved during the restructuring 5 years ago when the board suggested we could automate her position. Janet, who now spoke about me like I was a well-meaning but outdated impediment to progress. The final insult came 6 months ago, when Victoria suggested I might benefit from executive coaching to help me adapt to changing leadership styles. She'd presented it during a family dinner, framing it as a generous gift, an investment in my personal development. "There are some wonderful programs for senior executives transitioning to advisory roles," she'd explained, her tone gentle and caring. "Margaret, you've given so much to this company. Maybe it's time to let others contribute their energy while you provide wisdom and guidance." Senior executives transitioning to advisory roles. The euphemism was so perfectly crafted, so diplomatically venomous, that I almost admired the skill behind it. David had nodded enthusiastically. "That sounds perfect, Mom. You'd still be involved, but without all the daily stress." "Victoria's right. You've earned the right to relax. Earned the right to relax." As if my life's work was a burden I'd finally paid off, rather than a calling that gave my days meaning. That night, Robert had found me crying in my office at home, surrounded by photo albums filled with company milestones, employee celebrations, moments of triumph that suddenly felt hollow. "She's stealing it all," I'd whispered to him. "Not just the company, but the respect, The relationships, everything I built. And David can't see it, or won't see it. Robert had held me while I sobbed, his own anger carefully controlled. "What do you want to do?" he'd asked quietly. That's when the idea first took shape. If Victoria wanted to paint me as obsolete, as a burden holding back progress, then maybe it was time to show her what burden really looked like. Maybe it was time to stop fighting for something I could simply take away. The next morning, I'd called my lawyer and my financial advisor. By that afternoon, I had 3 potential buyers interested in Morrison Industries, each willing to pay above market value for a profitable, well-established company with a strong client base. The irony was perfect. Victoria had spent 2 years convincing everyone that the company would be better off without me. Now she was about to find out if she was right. Rolling over to face Robert, I finally spoke into the darkness. "Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then his hand found mine. "I think you're doing the only thing that lets you keep your dignity. And sometimes that's all we have left." Tomorrow, Victoria would learn that stealing someone's legacy isn't as simple as poisoning their reputation. Tomorrow, she'd discover that the old woman she'd been so eager to dismiss still had some lessons to teach. The morning after the party, my phone started ringing at 6:30. The first call was from Janet, her voice tight with panic. "Mrs. Henderson, I don't understand. The employees are asking questions and I don't know what to tell them. Is it true? Did you really sell Morrison Industries?" I sat at my kitchen table, watching Robert make coffee with the methodical precision he brought to everything. His presence anchored me, reminded me that I wasn't facing this alone. "Yes, Janet. The sale is final." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "But what about our jobs? What about everything we've built here?" For the first time since last night, I felt a stab of genuine regret. Janet wasn't part of Victoria's poison campaign. She was just a hard-working woman trying to support her family, caught in the crossfire of a war she hadn't chosen. "Hartfield Corporation is committed to maintaining operations," I said, trying to inject reassurance into my voice. "They're primarily interested in Morrison Industries because we're profitable and well-run. Good employees have nothing to fear." After I hung up, Robert placed a cup of coffee in front of me and sat down across the table. "How many more calls like that do you think you'll get today?" "Probably dozens." I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, drawing comfort from its heat. "The ones who matter will understand eventually. The others." I shrugged, surprised by how little I cared about the others anymore. The next call came from Tom Martinez, our operations manager. Unlike Janet, Tom had been one of Victoria's early converts, always ready to agree when she suggested my methods were outdated. "Margaret, what the hell is going on? You can't just sell the company without consulting the management team. We have a right to know what's happening to our futures." His tone grated against my nerves like sandpaper. Our futures. As if he'd built anything, risked anything, sacrificed anything to create those futures in the first place. "Tom, you'll need to direct all questions about personnel decisions to Hartfield Corporation. They'll be contacting department heads within the week to discuss transition plans." "This is insane," he sputtered. "Victoria said you'd been acting erratically, but I never thought you'd do something this destructive. Don't you care about what happens to the people who work for you?" I almost laughed at the accusation, Victoria said. Even now, even in his outrage, he couldn't form an opinion without referencing her guidance. "I care enough to make sure the company survives with its reputation intact," I replied evenly, something that was becoming increasingly unlikely under current circumstances. After I ended that call, Robert reached across the table and took my hand. "Any regrets yet?" I considered the question seriously. Was I starting to doubt myself? Was the magnitude of what I'd done beginning to sink in? "No," I said, and I meant it. If anything, these calls are reminding me why this was necessary. The third call was the one I'd been dreading most. David's voice crackled through the speaker, raw with emotion I couldn't quite identify. Hurt? Anger? Betrayal? "Mom, I need to understand what's happening. Victoria is beside herself. She keeps saying you've destroyed everything we worked for, everything we worked for." The pronouns stung more than I'd expected. When had my life's work become a collective effort that somehow excluded me? "David, can you come over? This conversation needs to happen in person. I can't leave Victoria right now. She's not taking this well." Of course he couldn't leave Victoria. My son, who'd once run to me with every skinned knee and broken heart, now couldn't spare an hour to sit with his mother while his wife processed the consequences of her own cruelty. Then bring her, I said, though the words tasted bitter. We all need to have this conversation. They arrived an hour later, and I could see the change in both of them immediately. Victoria's usual polished composure had cracked, revealing something desperate and angry underneath. Her hands shook slightly as she clutched her purse, and her perfectly styled hair showed signs of anxious running fingers through it. David looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed with the telltale signs of a sleepless night spent managing his wife's emotional crisis. He barely met my gaze as they settled onto the living room couch, sitting close enough that Victoria could grip his arm for support. "Mom," he started, his voice carefully controlled, "help me understand why you would sell the company without discussing it with family first. I thought we were partners in this business." Partners. The word was Victoria's. I was certain of it. David had never spoken about our relationship in business terms before she entered our lives. "Partners discuss major decisions together," Victoria added, her voice sharp despite its tremor. "Partners don't make unilateral choices that affect everyone's future." I looked at her steadily. This woman who'd spent 2 years systematically undermining my authority, questioning my decisions, and positioning herself as my inevitable replacement. "You're absolutely right, Victoria. Partners do discuss major decisions together." I paused, letting the words settle. "Which is why I found it interesting that you and David had apparently been discussing succession planning without including me in those conversations." The color drained from Victoria's face. David shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in the pattern on Robert's area rug. We were thinking about the future," David mumbled. "About what would happen eventually." "Eventually," I repeated. "And when exactly did eventually become immediately? When did planning for the distant future become active campaigning for my removal?" Victoria found her voice, though it came out higher than usual. "Margaret, I never campaigned for anything. If I expressed concerns about the company's direction, it was because I care about its success." "Concerns about the company's direction?" I echoed. "Is that what you call suggesting I was too emotional to handle client crises? Or recommending executive coaching to help me adapt to changing leadership styles? Or perhaps you mean last night, when you publicly called me a hag who steals profit from the company I built?" The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's grip on David's arm tightened until her knuckles went white. David stared at me with something that might have been recognition, as if he was finally hearing his wife's words through someone else's ears. "I was upset last night," Victoria said weakly. "I said things I didn't mean." "No," I replied quietly. "You said exactly what you meant. You said what you've been thinking for 2 years, what you've been carefully suggesting to anyone who would listen. The only difference was that last night, you said it out loud." Robert cleared his throat softly. "Margaret, should you tell them about Hartfield's decision regarding personnel?" I'd been dreading this moment, but it was time. The documentation I'd provided to Hartfield Corporation about Victoria's behavior hadn't been shared out of spite, but out of necessity. A responsible company needed to understand the dynamics they'd be inheriting. "Hartfield Corporation has completed their initial personnel review," I said, watching Victoria's face carefully. "They'll be retaining most of the current staff, with some exceptions." "Exceptions?" David's voice cracked slightly. "Department restructuring is common in acquisitions," I continued. "Hartfield has their own marketing team and won't be needing additional staff in that area." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She actually rocked backward on the couch, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing panic. But I've been essential to the marketing operations," she stammered. "I've increased our client base by 30% over the past 2 years. Using relationships and contracts I'd established over decades," I corrected gently. Hartfield was quite interested in understanding how those relationships had been managed recently. The full implications were starting to dawn on her. Victoria's eyes darted between David and me, looking for some sign that this was negotiable, that there was still a way to salvage her position. "What exactly did you tell them about me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told them the truth," I said simply. "I provided documentation of workplace interactions, employee complaints that had been filed, and examples of communications that demonstrated management style and professional judgment." David looked confused. "What employee complaints? You never mentioned any complaints." "Because they were dismissed," Victoria said quickly, but her voice carried no conviction. "They were minor workplace disagreements, nothing serious. Margaret Chen filed a formal complaint about public humiliation during budget meetings," I said, my voice steady and factual. Robert Williams documented overtime demands for personal projects accompanied by age-related harassment. Sarah Rodriguez reported deliberate scheduling conflicts designed to make her look incompetent. With each name, Victoria seemed to shrink further into the couch. These weren't random accusations. They were documented patterns of behavior that painted a clear picture of someone who used her position to belittle and intimidate others. David, Victoria turned to her husband with desperate eyes. You have to do something. Call the buyer. Explain that there's been a misunderstanding. Tell them I'm essential to the company's success. But David was staring at me with a strange expression, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Mom, are you saying Victoria has been mistreating employees? The question hung in the air like smoke. This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. This was when my son would have to choose between comfortable illusion and painful truth. I'm saying that Hartfield Corporation makes personnel decisions based on documented performance and professional conduct, I replied. What they decide about individual employees is their prerogative. Victoria shot to her feet, her composure finally shattering completely. This is revenge, pure and simple. You're punishing me because I had the courage to say what everyone was thinking. You can't stand that people see through your act anymore. The accusation might have hurt a day ago. Now it just felt like confirmation that I'd made the right choice. Victoria, I said, rising to face her, if you believe this is revenge, then you've learned nothing from the consequences of your own actions. She started toward the door, then spun back around. Come on, David. We don't have to stay here and listen to this. But David didn't move. He sat on the couch, staring at his hands, his entire worldview crumbling around him. David? Victoria's voice carried a note of panic now. David, we're leaving. My son looked up at his wife, then at me, then back at his wife. For the first time in years, I saw him thinking for himself, instead of simply absorbing someone else's opinions. Victoria, he said quietly, I think I need to hear what Mom has to say. Victoria stood frozen in my living room doorway, her face a mask of disbelief as David's words sank in. For 2 years, she'd controlled every conversation, guided every decision, shaped every opinion. Now, for the first time, her husband was choosing to listen to someone else. David, you can't be serious, she said, her voice climbing toward hysteria. She's manipulating you, just like she's been manipulating this entire situation. Can't you see that? But David wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at me with eyes that seemed suddenly older, wearier, as if he was waking up from a long dream. Mom, he said quietly, tell me about the employee complaints Victoria mentioned. Tell me everything. I glanced at Robert, who nodded encouragingly. This was the conversation I'd been avoiding for months, hoping that somehow David would see the truth on his own. But Victoria's influence had run too deep, her manipulation too skillful. Sometimes the only way to remove poison was to cut it out completely. Let's start with Margaret Chen, I said, settling back into my chair. She's 58 years old, been with the company for 14 years, started in data entry, worked her way up to senior accountant through night school and sheer determination. Last March, during the quarterly budget review, Victoria publicly criticized Margaret's reporting methods in front of the entire management team. David frowned. What kind of criticism? I pulled out a folder I'd prepared weeks ago, knowing this conversation would eventually come. Inside were printed emails, incident reports, and witness statements I'd been quietly collecting. Victoria told the room that Margaret's antiquated spreadsheet methods were holding back the accounting department's efficiency. She suggested that someone with more current technical skills should take over the quarterly reports. That doesn't sound unreasonable, Victoria interjected, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. If there were efficiency issues. Margaret's methods weren't inefficient, I continued, looking directly at David. They were thorough. Her reports caught discrepancies that automated systems missed. But Victoria wasn't interested in accuracy. She was interested in making Margaret look incompetent in front of her peers. I handed David a printed email from Margaret's file. This is the formal complaint Margaret filed 3 days after that meeting. She wrote that she felt humiliated and questioned whether her age was the real issue Victoria had with her work. David read the email, his frown deepening. What happened to this complaint? It was dismissed, Robert said quietly. Victoria's supervisor believed her explanation that she was simply trying to modernize departmental procedures. Because Victoria is very good at making her cruelty sound like business necessity, I added. She has a talent for wrapping personal attacks in professional language. Victoria moved away from the doorway, her hands clenched into fists. This is ridiculous. I was trying to improve efficiency, not attack anyone personally. If Margaret felt criticized, maybe she should have looked at her own performance instead of running to file complaints. The callousness in her voice made David's head snap up. He stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, and I recognized the expression on his face. It was the same look he'd worn as a child when he discovered that a friend had been lying to him. "There's more," I said gently. "Robert Williams, our IT support manager. 62 years old, been maintaining our computer systems for 8 years without a single major failure." I pulled out another set of documents. Victoria began requesting that Robert work overtime on what she called urgent system updates. These weren't company projects, they were personal tasks. Setting up her home office computer, troubleshooting her laptop, even helping her design PowerPoint presentations for outside consulting work she was doing. David's face went pale. She was using company employees for personal projects. When Robert tried to explain that these tasks weren't part of his job description, Victoria told him that in the modern workplace, employees need to be flexible and adaptive. She implied that someone his age might not understand how to be a team player. Victoria's laugh was sharp and defensive. Robert was being difficult. I offered to pay him overtime for the extra work. "Overtime that came out of the company budget," Robert pointed out, "not your personal account." I handed David another folder. Robert's complaint detailed 6 months of after-hours demands, along with comments about his slower processing speed, and suggestions that younger employees would be more responsive to urgent requests. "And this complaint was also dismissed?" David asked, though he already seemed to know the answer. Victoria's supervisor felt she was simply showing initiative by keeping older employees engaged with challenging projects, I said. The age-related comments were characterized as motivational rather than discriminatory. Victoria began pacing, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with increasing agitation. "I can't believe you're twisting every interaction into some kind of conspiracy. These were legitimate workplace issues." "What about Sarah Rodriguez?" I asked, opening a third folder. 55 years old, cleaning supervisor, been keeping our offices immaculate for 6 years. David looked confused. What could Victoria possibly have had against a cleaning supervisor? Sarah works the evening shift, cleaning offices after business hours. Last year, Victoria began scheduling late meetings that required certain conference rooms to be cleaned again the next morning. When Sarah explained that the cleaning schedule was designed around normal business hours, Victoria complained to HR that Sarah was inflexible and didn't understand customer service. I pulled out a series of emails. Victoria wrote that Sarah seemed confused by simple instructions and suggested that language barriers might be affecting her ability to understand requests. Language barriers? David's voice was tight. "Sarah was born in New Mexico," Robert said dryly. "Her English is perfect. She's actually bilingual, which has been helpful when we've had Spanish-speaking clients visit the offices." Victoria stopped pacing. "I never said anything about language barriers specifically. If there were communication issues. You wrote, and I quote, 'Perhaps we need cleaning staff who can better understand and respond to American business expectations.'" I read from the printed email. Sarah filed a complaint alleging ethnic discrimination. The silence that followed was suffocating. David stared at the email in his hands, reading Victoria's words over and over, as if hoping they would somehow say something different. "There are 8 more complaints in these files," I said quietly, "all from employees over 50, all dismissed because Victoria's explanations always sounded reasonable to supervisors who didn't see the pattern." "What pattern?" David whispered. "Your wife systematically targeted older employees, using their age, experience, and background as weapons against them. She made them feel worthless, outdated, and unwelcome in their own workplace." Victoria finally exploded. "That's not true. I was trying to bring fresh thinking to a stagnant company. Sometimes that means making difficult personnel decisions. Sometimes that means having honest conversations about performance." "Honest conversations," I repeated. "Is that what you call telling the Henderson account team that I was too emotional to handle client crises? Or suggesting to the board that I needed executive coaching because I was resistant to change?" David looked up sharply. "You told the board that Mom needed coaching?" Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The company was going through challenges. I thought professional development might help." "You thought it might help push me aside," I said calmly. "Just like you pushed aside Margaret Chen, Robert Williams, Sarah Rodriguez, and everyone else who stood in the way of your vision of what the company should become." "And what was that vision?" David asked, his voice barely audible. I looked at my son. this man I'd raised to be kind and thoughtful, and saw that he was finally ready to hear the truth. A company run by younger, more modern thinkers, I said. A company where experience was seen as a liability rather than an asset. A company where Victoria could position herself as the inevitable successor to an outdated founder who didn't know when to step aside. Victoria sank into the chair across from us, her defiance crumbling into something that looked almost like defeat. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered. "What wasn't supposed to be like this?" David asked, turning to face his wife directly. She looked at him with tears in her eyes, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "The company was dying under her leadership," Victoria said, gesturing weakly toward me. "The methods were outdated, the client base was aging, the employees were getting comfortable instead of innovative. I thought if I could help guide a transition." "You thought you could take over," David finished, his voice flat. "I thought I could help," Victoria insisted. "I thought I could bring new energy, new ideas. I thought I could help the company grow instead of just survive." "By tearing down the person who built it," Robert said quietly. Victoria's tears came harder now. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I just wanted to contribute something meaningful. I wanted to matter." For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt a flicker of understanding for my daughter-in-law. Not forgiveness. What she'd done was unforgivable. But I recognized the hunger in her voice, the desperate need to prove her worth by diminishing others. "Victoria," I said gently, "you could have mattered. You could have contributed, but not by destroying the people around you." David stood up abruptly, walking to the window and staring out at the street. When he spoke, his voice was hollow. "How long have you been planning to take over the company?" Victoria wiped her eyes, leaving mascara streaks on her cheeks. "It wasn't a plan, exactly. It was more like an evolution. I saw opportunities to improve things, and I took them. The opportunities included making my mother look incompetent," David said without turning around. "I never said she was incompetent." "You didn't have to say it directly," I said. "You just had to plant the seeds and let other people reach that conclusion on their own. It's actually quite sophisticated. Much more effective than direct confrontation." David finally turned back to us, and the expression on his face broke my heart. He looked lost, betrayed, like a child who discovered that everything he believed about the world was wrong. "Victoria," he said quietly, "did you ever love me? Or was I just convenient?" The question hung in the air between them like a live wire. Victoria's face crumpled, and she reached toward him desperately. "Of course I love you, David. How can you even ask that?" But he stepped away from her reaching hands. "Because I'm starting to realize that I don't know you at all. The woman I married wouldn't systematically destroy people to get ahead. The woman I married wouldn't humiliate my mother at a company party." "I was angry," Victoria sobbed. "I felt threatened. Your mother was never going to accept me as a successor, and I knew it." "Because you never gave her a reason to," David said simply. "You spent 2 years undermining her instead of learning from her. You treated her like an obstacle instead of a mentor." I watched my son process the truth about his marriage, about his wife, about the years he'd spent choosing her narrative over mine. The pain on his face was almost unbearable, but it was necessary. Some wounds have to be cleaned before they can heal. "David," Victoria whispered, "please, we can fix this. We can start over somewhere else. The company doesn't matter. We matter." He looked at her for a long moment, and I saw something die in his eyes. "The company mattered to you when you thought you could control it," he said. "My mother mattered to you when you thought she was weak enough to push aside. Nothing matters to you unless it serves your purposes." The truth of his words seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow. She doubled over as if in pain, her sobs echoing through the quiet room. But David wasn't finished. He turned to me, his eyes red with unshed tears. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't see what she was doing. I'm so sorry I laughed last night. I'm so sorry I chose her version of events over yours." The apology I'd been waiting 2 years to hear, the recognition I'd thought I might never receive. But instead of triumph, all I felt was exhaustion and a deep, aching sadness for the time we'd lost. "I know you are, David," I said softly, "but sorry isn't enough anymore." The words hung between David and me like a chasm that couldn't be bridged with simple apologies. Victoria's sobbing filled the silence, but it sounded distant, irrelevant, like background noise from a television in another room. David's face crumpled. "What do you mean, sorry isn't enough?" Mom, I know I made mistakes, but I thought if I acknowledged them. David, I said gently, acknowledgement is just the first step. The damage that's been done isn't something that can be fixed with an apology and a promise to do better. He sank back onto the couch, suddenly looking much older than his 36 years. Then what can I do? How can I make this right? Before I could answer, Victoria lifted her head, her mascara-streaked face desperate and calculating. Margaret, please. I know I made mistakes, but we're family. Families forgive each other. Families work through problems together. The audacity of her words nearly took my breath away. Even now, even after being exposed completely, she was still trying to manipulate the situation, still trying to position herself as a victim deserving of compassion. Victoria, I said, my voice steady despite the anger burning in my chest, you spent 2 years systematically destroying my relationships with my employees, my reputation in my own company, and my connection with my son. You don't get to claim the protection of family bonds that you've been actively working to sever. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, a gesture that made her look younger and more vulnerable, which I suspected was intentional. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I never wanted to destroy your relationship with David. I love him. I love this family. You love what this family could provide you, Robert said quietly from his chair. There's a difference. Victoria turned toward him, her eyes flashing with something that looked like her old arrogance. You don't know anything about my feelings for David. You weren't there for all the private moments, all the times I supported him through work stress and family pressures. Family pressures that you created, I pointed out. David never experienced stress about disappointing me until you convinced him that my expectations were unreasonable. He never questioned his place in the company until you suggested he was being held back by outdated leadership. David was staring at his hands again, and I could see him running through memories, re-examining conversations and moments through this new lens of understanding. The process was painful to watch, like seeing someone realize they'd been living in a house built on quicksand. The worst part, he said finally, his voice barely audible, is that I defended you. When Mom would try to talk to me about concerns she had, I'd shut her down. I'd tell her she was being unfair to you, that she needed to give you a chance to prove yourself. Victoria reached for his hand, but he pulled away. David, I was trying to prove myself. Maybe I went about it the wrong way, but I was trying to earn my place in this family, in this company. By pushing everyone else out, he said, looking at her directly for the first time since the conversation began. By making them feel small and worthless so you could feel big and important. That wasn't my intention. Your intentions don't matter, David said, and I heard an echo of my own voice in his words. The impact matters. The results matter. The people you hurt matter. I felt a flicker of pride watching my son finally think independently, finally judge actions by their consequences rather than their stated motivations. But the pride was tempered by sadness for all the time we'd lost, all the conversations we should have had, all the support I could have provided if Victoria hadn't been standing between us. Victoria stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Fine. I made mistakes. I hurt people. I'm willing to admit that now. But Margaret, you've destroyed my career. You've made sure I can't work in this industry anymore. Isn't that punishment enough? The question revealed everything about how she still saw the situation. Even now, she viewed her exclusion from Hartfield Corporation as punishment rather than consequence. She couldn't understand that her behavior had made her unemployable, not my documentation of it. Victoria, I said carefully, I didn't destroy your career. I provided Hartfield Corporation with accurate information about workplace dynamics they needed to understand. What they chose to do with that information was their decision. You could have chosen not to provide it, she shot back. You could have given me a chance to start fresh with the new owners. The way you gave Margaret Chen a chance to start fresh after humiliating her in front of her colleagues? Robert asked. The way you gave Robert Williams a chance to do his actual job without harassment? The way you gave Sarah Rodriguez a chance to work without having her heritage questioned? Victoria flinched at each name, but her defensive posture didn't soften. Those situations were different. Those were legitimate workplace issues. No, David said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been all morning. They weren't different at all. You saw people you considered obstacles, and you found ways to diminish them. You did the same thing to my mother that you did to those employees, except you used me as your weapon instead of HR complaints. The accuracy of his assessment seemed to hit Victoria like a slap. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing without sound. David, she finally whispered. I never meant to hurt your mother. I never meant to hurt you. But you did, he said simply. And the fact that it wasn't your intention doesn't make the damage disappear. I watched this exchange with complicated feelings. Part of me was relieved that David was finally seeing clearly. Part of me was proud that he was taking responsibility for his own choices instead of just blaming Victoria for deceiving him. But part of me was also heartbroken, watching my son's marriage disintegrate in my living room, even though I knew it was necessary. "What happens now?" David asked, looking between Victoria and me. "Where do we go from here?" Victoria jumped on the question like a lifeline. "We work on rebuilding trust. We go to counseling. We figure out how to be a family again, how to support each other through this difficult time." I almost laughed at her presumption. After everything that had been revealed, she still thought she could negotiate her way back into our lives, still believed that the right combination of words could erase the damage she'd caused. "Victoria," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "you're not part of this family anymore. That ended when you publicly humiliated me at a company function and laughed about it." Her face went white. "You can't just cut me out. David is my husband. We have a life together. You have a life built on lies and manipulation," I replied. "Whether David chooses to continue that life is his decision, but it won't include me." David looked up sharply. "Mom, are you saying you won't have a relationship with me if I stay married to Victoria?" The question I'd been dreading and hoping to avoid. I didn't want to put David in the position of choosing between his wife and his mother, but I also couldn't pretend that Victoria's presence in our lives was sustainable. "David, I'm saying that I can't have Victoria in my life anymore. What you choose to do with that information is up to you." Victoria started crying again, but these tears felt different, less manipulative, more genuinely desperate. "This is what you wanted all along, isn't it? You never accepted me. You were just waiting for an opportunity to drive a wedge between David and me. I wanted to welcome you into our family," I said honestly. "I wanted to share the business I'd built with someone who would love it and nurture it the way I had. I wanted my son to be happy. Then why are you destroying his marriage?" "I'm not destroying anything," I replied. "I'm just refusing to pretend anymore that your behavior is acceptable. I'm refusing to enable the kind of treatment you've shown me and my employees. I'm refusing to sacrifice my dignity to maintain the illusion of family harmony." David stood up and walked to the mantel, staring at the family photos displayed there. Pictures from holidays, birthdays, company events, memories that now felt tainted by the knowledge of what had been happening behind the scenes. "Victoria," he said without turning around, "I need you to leave." "What?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I need time to think. And I can't do that with you here trying to manage my reactions and control the conversation." She looked at him in shock. "David, you can't be serious. I'm your wife. You're the woman who's been lying to me for 2 years, he said, finally turning to face her. "You're the woman who convinced me to turn against my own mother. You're the woman who systematically destroyed other people to advance your own agenda. I'm also the woman who loves you," she said desperately. He stared at her for a long moment, and I could see him weighing that claim against everything he'd learned this morning. "Maybe you do," he said finally. "But I'm not sure that's enough anymore." Victoria gathered her purse with shaking hands, her composure completely shattered. At the door, she turned back one last time. "Margaret, I hope you're satisfied. You've gotten everything you wanted." "I didn't want any of this," I replied honestly. "I wanted to work with you, not against you. I wanted to build something together, not watch it all fall apart." After she left, the house felt different, lighter somehow, as if a oppressive weight had been lifted. David remained standing by the mantel, his shoulders hunched with grief and confusion. "I don't know how to process all of this," he said quietly. 2 hours ago, I thought I had a marriage and a career and a future all mapped out. Now I don't know what I have." I joined him by the mantel, standing close enough to offer comfort, but not so close that I was crowding him. "You have time to figure it out. You have space to make decisions based on what you actually want, instead of what someone else is telling you to want." "Do I have a mother who forgives me for being an idiot?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. I put my arm around his shoulders, and for a moment he was my little boy again, seeking comfort after a painful lesson about the world's complexity. "You have a mother who loves you," I said. "But David, forgiveness isn't the same as pretending nothing happened. We have work to do if we want to rebuild our relationship." He nodded, leaning into my embrace. "Where do we start?" "We start with honesty," I said. "We start with you acknowledging that you chose to believe Victoria's version of events instead of trusting your own mother. We start with you understanding that trust, once broken, has to be rebuilt slowly." "I can do that," he said. I want to do that. I held my son in my living room, surrounded by the remnants of a family that had been fractured by deceit and manipulation. But for the first time in 2 years, I felt hope. Not for easy reconciliation or quick fixes, but for the possibility of rebuilding something authentic and strong from the wreckage Victoria had left behind. The company was gone, sold to strangers who would reshape it according to their own vision. Victoria was gone, excluded from an industry where her behavior had made her unemployable. But David was still here, finally ready to see clearly, finally ready to choose truth over comfortable lies. It wasn't the ending I'd planned when I started this journey, but it was honest. And after 2 years of living in a web of manipulation and half-truths, honesty felt like the most precious gift I could ask for. 3 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, a modest ranch house with large windows that filled the rooms with natural light. The moving boxes were finally unpacked, the furniture arranged just the way I wanted it. After selling Morrison Industries, Robert and I had decided to downsize, to find a place that belonged to us rather than our professional legacy. The morning sun streamed across the breakfast table where David sat, helping me sort through old company photographs. It had become our Saturday ritual, these quiet conversations over coffee, slowly rebuilding the connection that Victoria's manipulation had nearly destroyed. Look at this one, David said, holding up a photo from the company's 10th anniversary party. You look so proud. I studied the image, myself at 43, standing in front of a banner celebrating our growth from a garage startup to a regional success story. I was smiling, but there was something in my posture that spoke of exhaustion, of the weight I'd carried alone for so many years. I was proud, I said, pouring fresh coffee into our mugs. But I was also scared. Every milestone felt like it could be the last one, like I was always just one mistake away from losing everything. Is that why you worked so much when I was growing up? He asked quietly. Why you missed some of my games and school events? These were the conversations we'd been having, honest examinations of our shared history, acknowledging the imperfections that Victoria had exploited to drive us apart. David was learning to see our past through adult eyes rather than through the lens of resentment Victoria had provided him. Partly, I admitted. I told myself I was building something for you, securing your future. But I was also proving something to myself, proving that a widow with no business education could succeed in a man's world. He nodded thoughtfully. Victoria used to say that you'd never learn to let other people help you, that you hoarded control because you didn't trust anyone else to care about the company as much as you did. And was she right about that? David considered the question seriously. Maybe partially, but now I understand why. You'd built something from nothing, sacrificed everything for it. Of course you were protective of it. Victoria made that protectiveness sound like a character flaw instead of a natural response to being the sole custodian of something precious. The insight pleased me more than I'd expected. David was learning to think critically about the narratives he'd absorbed, to recognize how Victoria had twisted reasonable emotions into evidence of unreasonable behavior. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it with a smile. It's from Margaret Chen. She wants to know if I'm free for lunch next week. How are the Hartfield people treating her? David asked. Very well, actually. They promoted her to accounting supervisor last month. Apparently they value experience and institutional knowledge more than Victoria's former supervisor did. It had been one of the unexpected joys of the past 3 months, reconnecting with employees I'd lost touch with during Victoria's campaign to isolate me. Margaret Chen, Robert Williams, Sarah Rodriguez, and others had reached out once word spread about the sale and Victoria's departure. Their loyalty, their genuine affection for me had been a balm for wounds I'd forgotten I was carrying. Have you heard anything about how Victoria is doing? David asked, his voice carefully neutral. We'd established early in our reconciliation that he could ask about her, that I wouldn't punish him for still caring about his wife even after everything that had happened. Their divorce had been finalized 2 weeks ago. Victoria had moved back to her parents' house in another state, rather than fight for assets she knew she couldn't claim. Janet mentioned she heard Victoria was working at a small marketing firm in Phoenix, I said. Entry-level position, from what I understand. David nodded, his expression sad but resigned. She texted me last week. She wanted to know if there was any chance of reconciliation, if we could try counseling. And what did you tell her? That I hoped she was getting the help she needed, but that our marriage was over. He picked up another photograph, this one showing the 3 of us at a company Christmas party 2 years ago. Victoria was smiling brilliantly between David and me, her arm possessive around his waist. It's strange, looking at pictures like this now. I can see things I missed at the time. Like what? Like how you're standing slightly apart from us, how your smile doesn't reach your eyes, like how Victoria is positioned between us, literally creating distance. He set the photo aside. I thought she was trying to bring us together as a family. Now I can see she was making sure we never connected directly. The doorbell interrupted our conversation, and I looked through the peephole to see a delivery truck in the driveway. The driver handed me a large package addressed to Margaret Henderson, founder Morrison Industries. David helped me carry it to the kitchen table, where I opened it to reveal a beautifully crafted wooden plaque. The engraving read, "In recognition of Margaret Henderson's 38 years of exemplary leadership and commitment to employee welfare. With gratitude from the Morrison Industries staff, 1985-2023. A card was tucked inside the box, signed by dozens of employees, current and former, young and old, people from every department and level of the company. The message was simple but profound. Thank you for showing us what principled leadership looks like. I felt tears prick my eyes as I read name after name, many accompanied by brief personal notes. Janet wrote, "You taught me that respect is earned through consistency, not demanded through fear." Robert Williams added, "Your door was always open, your advice always honest." That meant everything. "Mom," David said softly, reading over my shoulder. "Do you see this? These people didn't just work for you, they genuinely cared about you." "I know," I whispered, overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection. I'd forgotten during those last 2 years when Victoria was working so hard to isolate me. I'd started to believe that maybe I really was just an obstacle to progress. "You were never an obstacle," he said firmly. "You were the foundation everything else was built on." Victoria couldn't see that because she was too focused on what she thought she deserved, instead of what she'd actually earned. I set the plaque on the mantel where it caught the morning light. This recognition meant more to me than any business award I'd ever received, because it came from the people who'd actually worked alongside me, who'd seen me during crises and celebrations, who'd known me as more than just a name on an organizational chart. "I have something I want to tell you," David said, returning to his seat at the table. "I've been offered a position with a consulting firm in Denver. It's a good opportunity, a chance to use my experience helping other companies navigate transitions and acquisitions." "That sounds like exactly the kind of work you'd be good at," I said, meaning it. "When would you start?" "Next month if I accept, but I wanted to talk to you first. Make sure you're okay with me moving away." The question revealed how much our relationship had changed over the past 3 months. The old David, influenced by Victoria's narrative about my controlling nature, might have presented the move as a fait accompli, as evidence of his independence from his overbearing mother. This David was asking for my blessing, treating me as a valued advisor rather than an obstacle to overcome. "David, I want you to take the job if it feels right to you," I said. "But I want you to take it because it's what you want, not because you're running away from the complications here." He smiled, and I saw the boy I'd raised, thoughtful, considerate, eager to do the right thing. "I'm not running away. If anything, I feel more grounded than I have in years, more like myself." "Then you should go. Build something new. Something that's entirely yours." We spent the rest of the morning going through more photographs, sharing memories that had been distorted by Victoria's influence and reclaiming them as our own. Around noon, Robert returned from his morning golf game, carrying groceries for the lunch he'd promised to cook. "How are my favorite people today?" he asked, kissing my cheek and squeezing David's shoulder. "Looking at old pictures and planning David's escape to Denver," I replied, earning a laugh from both men. "About time," Robert said. "You need to get out there and build your own empire. Show your mother it's a genetic trait." As Robert busied himself with lunch preparations, David and I moved to the living room, where afternoon light was painting everything in soft gold. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the morning's conversations. "Mom," David said eventually, "I need to ask you something and I want you to be completely honest with me. Always," I promised. "Do you think you'll ever be able to completely forgive me? Not just say you forgive me, but actually feel it?" The question I'd been asking myself for weeks. Forgiveness wasn't a switch I could flip, wasn't a decision I could make once and be done with. It was a process, messy and nonlinear, complicated by love and disappointment and hope. "I think forgiveness is something we build together," I said carefully. "Every honest conversation we have, every time you choose to see me clearly instead of through someone else's interpretation, Every time you trust me enough to be vulnerable, those are the building blocks of forgiveness. He nodded, understanding. And if I mess up again? If I make mistakes or disappoint you? Then we'll deal with it honestly, the way families should. We'll talk about it instead of letting someone else interpret it for us. We'll choose trust over suspicion, direct communication over manipulation. I can do that, he said. I want to do that. Good, I smiled, because I'm not going anywhere. I'm not retiring. I'm not fading away. I'm not becoming a sweet old lady who stays quiet to keep the peace. If you want a relationship with me, you get all of me. Opinions, standards, and all. David laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from him in months. I wouldn't want it any other way. That evening, after David had left and Robert had settled into his favorite chair with a book, I found myself back on the porch, looking out at the quiet neighborhood street. The house across from us had a family with young children, and I could hear them playing in their backyard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. 3 months ago, I'd been the CEO of a successful company, respected in my industry, financially secure, but emotionally isolated. Now I was unemployed, living in a smaller house, with an uncertain future stretching ahead of me. By most measures, I'd lost more than I'd gained. But sitting there in the gathering dusk, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace, real peace, not the fragile kind that depends on everyone else staying quiet and not rocking the boat. This was the peace that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to apologize for it. Victoria had tried to convince everyone that I was an obstacle to progress, a relic clinging to relevance in a changing world. But she'd been wrong about the fundamental nature of progress. Real progress isn't about discarding wisdom in favor of novelty, or replacing experience with enthusiasm. Real progress is about building on strong foundations while adapting to new circumstances. I'd given Morrison Industries the strongest possible foundation: ethical leadership, loyal employees, solid client relationships, and sustainable business practices. What Hartfield Corporation chose to build on that foundation was their business now, but I was confident they'd chosen well. They'd kept the employees who mattered, promoted the people Victoria had tried to diminish, and apparently valued institutional knowledge over flashy presentations. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet. Mrs. Henderson, I know you said you weren't ready to think about working again, but there's something I'd like to run by you. Would you be interested in helping other small business owners navigate transitions and acquisitions? I think there might be a real need for that kind of consulting. I smiled, typing back. Tell me more. Maybe retirement wasn't in my immediate future after all. Maybe there were other companies that could benefit from the lessons I'd learned, other families that needed help navigating the complex dynamics of family businesses. Maybe Victoria's campaign to push me aside had actually freed me to do something even more meaningful than running a single company. Robert appeared in the doorway, holding 2 glasses of wine. Plotting your next move? He asked, settling into the chair beside mine. Maybe, I admitted. Janet thinks there might be a market for my particular brand of experience. Your particular brand of not taking nonsense from manipulative people who mistake cruelty for strength? He asked with a grin. Something like that. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood settle into evening routines. Porch lights flickered on, children were called inside for dinner, the day's activities wound down into the quiet promise of rest. Do you have any regrets? Robert asked quietly. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret selling the company instead of fighting to keep it? Did I regret the way I'd handled Victoria's campaign against me? Did I regret the months of alienation from David? I regret that it took me so long to recognize what Victoria was doing, I said finally. I regret that I let her drive a wedge between David and me. I regret that other employees got hurt in the crossfire. But not the sale itself? No, I said with certainty. The sale protected something more important than my ownership of the company. It protected my integrity. If I'd stayed and fought, I would have had to become something I didn't want to be. I would have had to play Victoria's games, use her tactics, compromise my principles to compete with her manipulation. Robert raised his glass in a small toast. To integrity, then, and to new beginnings. To new beginnings, I agreed, touching my glass to his. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I thought about David packing for his move to Denver, about Victoria starting over in Phoenix, about the employees at Morrison Industries adapting to new leadership. All of us were beginning new chapters, finding new ways to define ourselves beyond the roles we'd played in the drama that had consumed the past 2 years. Victoria had called me a hag who stole profit, had tried to paint me as a grasping, selfish obstacle to progress. But she'd been wrong about everything that mattered. I wasn't holding anyone back. I was the one who'd built the platform everyone else was standing on. I wasn't stealing from the company. I was protecting the values that had made it worth stealing in the first place. The future stretched ahead of me, uncertain but full of possibility. For the first time in decades, I could choose what to do next based on what I wanted rather than what was expected of me. I could use my experience to help other entrepreneurs navigate challenges, could mentor young business owners without worrying about hidden agendas or competitive manipulation. I could be exactly who I was without apology or compromise. It was, I realized, the retirement gift I'd never known I wanted, the freedom to be authentically myself, surrounded by people who value that authenticity instead of trying to reshape it for their own purposes. Victoria's toast had been meant to humiliate me, to diminish me in the eyes of people I'd spent decades serving. Instead, it had freed me from the exhausting work of pretending that everyone's opinion mattered equally, that all perspectives deserve the same consideration regardless of their foundation in truth or malice. Some battles are won not by fighting harder, but by choosing not to fight at all. Some victories come not from defeating your opponents, but from refusing to become the kind of person who would use their tactics. In the end, I'd kept the only thing that really mattered: my integrity, my dignity, and the respect of people whose opinions were actually worth having. Everything else was just business.